Welcome back, everyone. Before I continue, I just wanted to give a shout out to Murac Books. They've recently published edition 7 of Murac's C#, and that's the book that I'm going to be following throughout this entire video series. It's exceptionally well done. There's a lot of resources. I highly recommend anybody who wants to learn how to do C# to buy this book. I've been going through it over the last several days, and it's just full of absolutely outstanding content. So that's why I've chosen to use this book throughout the entire video series. So if you want to get that, then I guess you can get it off of probably Amazon or Murac Books. And as far as I know, it just was published in November or December. So they're just putting out this version now. And I believe the last version was from 2015. So I highly recommend that you get the 7th edition because it's integrated better with Visual Studio and .NET Core and some other new technologies that have come out under Microsoft. So I highly recommend that you go and get this book. Murac C# 7th edition. It's an absolutely outstanding book. I want to be very clear about this video series in the fact that this is not going to be based on a web application. But I want to highlight your attention to the fact that there are 3 different platforms for developing Windows desktop applications with .NET. And the first one is the one that we're going to be using throughout this course, which is going to be Windows Forms. But there's also Windows Presentation Framework, and there's Universal Windows Platform. Additionally, we have 2 platforms for developing web applications, and they're ASP.NET Web Forms and also ASP.NET Core MVC. MVC stands for Model View Control. And that's kind of the next evolution. So once you have mastered or become really comfortable with C# and you want to get into web development, that's sort of the next progression in anybody's learning. Learn C#, and then if you want to get into web development, then you're going to graduate onto ASP.NET Core MVC. This is an important slide to understand in that we've got at the very top band these .NET applications. So you see Visual Basic, Visual C#, C++, F#, and they are able to communicate with these .NET frameworks. Okay, and you can see there in the middle, it's Windows Form classes, ASP.NET classes. So this is basically the library that holds other classes that other people or other developers have created on behalf of Microsoft or .NET. Okay, and you as a developer get to go to this library and use a lot of that functionality. So these classes or just functions or whatever it is that you can go to the library and get these functions or methods. Okay, and down at the bottom you can see the different operating systems that this all works on. If we look at this slide here, it talks about sort of the stages from starting to develop a project in order to write the code. You've got to start somewhere. So at step 1 is that you have an IDE. In this case, we're using Visual Studio 2019, and you build out your source files. And when those source files are done in C#, they need to be compiled in order to be used. Okay, so the next step is you compile the code, and once it's compiled, it's assembled. Okay, and then it goes back out to the .NET framework, and that's where you can actually see. So this is your runtime product of all of the code that you've created. So when we look at the IDE itself, this is where we want to start producing code. Okay, and in the last video, we installed Visual Studio 2019. And what I want to show you on the right is your Solution Explorer. Okay, this section over here where my mouse is pointing, this is where all of our individual files are going to be kept. Okay, this box right here that you see, this is the design view. Okay, so this is, I want you to think about this as if though you were doing it with paper, some glue, and maybe, paper, stuff like that. And you were physically going to make a model of this stuff. So think of that a little bit as your playground to figure out the common look and feel that you want your desktop application to have. Okay, and that's all done in your design view. Okay, and you can see in this example it says form investment. There's this other file over here, and we'll look at that in a minute. And that is where you write the code in behind. And that code is all linked to the functionality. That's what gives functionality to all of these little objects on your screen. Over here in your toolbox, this is where you get all of the little classes. Okay, now we're going to come back and we're going to spend some time talking about classes, the difference between a class and an actual object. Okay, but it's important to understand, if you have an understanding of classes and objects, then you'll know what I mean when I say that in this current state right now, as I'm picking it, it's no different than selecting the class that you want to do. And once I grab one of these classes over here and I drag them over onto my design view, they get instantiated into physical objects. Okay, and we're going to talk about that more in depth because it's very, very important that you understand the difference between a class and an object. Okay, because sometimes new programmers get a little bit fuzzy on what the difference between a class is and an object. But don't worry, I am going to clear that up for you. So rest assured you will not be confused between the difference of a class and an object. What you can see here on this slide is these little black points all around the different labels that we have. And this is an example of when we begin to create our Windows form applications, we usually start in the design view. And this is where we get to go to the toolbox and start placing the different objects onto our form that we want to use. And once we place them there, then the next step is typically to go to our properties box here. And we can start manipulating the properties associated with those specific objects. Okay. And then the next thing that we'll do after that is we typically go and write the code to make this functional. And we do that in a different file. So you know, as I said earlier, this is in the design view. Okay. There's no functionality in the design view other than to say, this is how I have it laid out. Okay. This is my architectural design, let's say. Okay, but this is not the place where you've done, let's say, all the fancy calculations to make it all work. That's what this file is. Okay, in the previous file, you saw the design view. This is now your code view. This is where you're going to make all of that stuff function that you had placed on your form in the design view. And we're going to be doing a lot of this. This is a very important slide to understand. Okay, there are two different icons that are used in the Solution Explorer, and you can see those here. You've got the C# icon, and then you have this little icon here that looks like a form. Okay, there are other icons as well. That's a file folder. This is your dependencies. There are different icons, but we want to primarily concern ourselves with the C# icon and what looks like an actual Windows form. So each form is defined by two C# source files, where each file contains a partial class. Okay, so you have two source files eventually going to come together as one, but they make two different partial classes. And the file with the CS extension, which looks like the C# icon, contains the code that's entered by the programmer, and the file with the designer.cs extension contains the code that generated when the programmer works with the form. Okay, so when we're in the design view, that's our designer.cs. Okay, when we're doing C#, that's just straight C#. Okay, so when the project is compiled, okay, we've written our project and we hit the compile button. These two partial classes are combined into a single class that determines the appearance and operation of the form. Okay, so what we're trying to do is take class A and B and jam it together to create C after it's been compiled. Okay, the source code file that doesn't define a form is usually stored in a single C# source file. Okay, So we'll see more of that later as well. So when you create a brand new project, Visual Studio creates this very important file, this program.cs. And let's see if I can underline it with a pen. It is program.cs. Okay, that gets created automatically when you generate a brand new project. Okay, and it's a Windows form application. The file contains the C# code that starts the application and runs the first form in the application. Okay, this is a very, very important form. And at some point when we start creating splash pages and stuff like that, we'll go in and actually manipulate this program.cs file a little bit. So when you create a new Windows form application for .NET Core, Visual Studio automatically adds 2 frameworks under the dependencies group. And we'll look at the dependencies as well. These frameworks contain assemblies for the namespaces that contain the classes available for the project. And you can see here in this view where we've moved around some of the different boxes, but you can see in the Solution Explorer, that last file we were talking about this here, these dependencies, okay? And down here at the bottom, we're talking about program.cs. This is a very, very important file. And this is what gets created as soon as you open up a brand new project. Okay, so we can manipulate this one here, and this one here has those 2 starting frameworks in there inside the dependencies folder. What I'd like to do now is to start our very first project. And I'm going to go over to create a new project. And you'll see C# at the top, Windows, and desktop. And here I'm going to select Windows Forms app.net. I'm going to hit next. And I'm going to call it invoice total. And I'm actually going to not add any spaces to it at all. Okay, create. And you'll see it takes some time, but it's doing a lot in the background while we're waiting. So initially what I want you to notice is right here, we have this programs.cs file. We also have these dependencies, and this is the frameworks. Within the frameworks in this file, you see that I have 2 other files. It's called Microsoft.NET Core.app and then Microsoft Windows Desktop.app.Windows Forms. And these 2 further break down into many different files themselves. As you can see, there's an enormous amount of different files in there. And as I spoke previously, there's this particular file right here, this program.cs. And I've already opened it up, but it basically looks like this. And what's really interesting about this is that it is sort of the initial starting project file, and you can see that it's a class all on its own called program. And there are many different methods or functions within this main. Okay, so if you've used other programming languages before, you've always known about this main function. Okay, so this program.cs is where we house our main function to run all other project files from. Okay, so this is a pretty important file, and we will do a little bit of manipulation to this in the course, but not too much. But right now, all we're beginning with is this form design, okay, and our program file, which contains the main function. Okay, and we talked earlier about having 2 files that get combined into one. Well, we don't have that at the moment because we haven't done any compilation yet. One thing we can do right now is actually go up to the top menu and click the Debug menu. And there's a drop down here. There's Start Debugging and there's Start Without Debugging. There is a subtle difference. And in this particular case, I'm going to say Start Without Debugging because we haven't put any code in here which requires the computer to look for errors. And when we do look for errors, you can see down at the bottom of the screen, we have this error list. And it tells us if we have an error or warnings or any other messages. Okay, but since we haven't done any code, I'm not anticipating any errors. So if I go back to my output, or I can stay in my error list, I can go to start debugging. I can go start without debugging. And there's another option here, which is build solution. This is where we're telling the compiler, yes, go ahead and build the solution in the background. And I'm going to do that right now. I don't need to, but just for demonstration purposes, it's asking, or it's doing its compilation process in the background. Now you can see that I'm getting this message in the yellow band at the top. It says use AI Assisted Intellicode for completions based on your code in invoice total. Click yes, enable it. You agree to the license terms. I'm actually going to say that yes, I'll enable it. I honestly don't know how it works, but I could read through this and find out more information if I want. But what I'm going to do is turn it off. Okay, and I'm going to ignore the message. Now that I've hit the compile button though, you see that I've got this line down here in my output window. It says build, 1 succeeded, 0 failed, 0 up to date, 0 skipped. All that means is that it's actually compiled it in the background, or it's built the code and it has not found any errors. And if I hit the error button here, you can see there's no errors listed. So I'll go back to debug and I'll do start without debugging. And as expected, all I got was this form with no functionality to it whatsoever, other than the menu bar at the top, which is minimize, maximize, and close. Okay. So one point I want to make about this debugging, you notice that there was no processes working in the background. I hit the start without debugging, which meant nothing was going on in the background. But let's look at it when I say start debugging. What you're going to see is some other processes happening in the background, which you can see on this diagnostic tool on the right side. You can see different things that are going on in the background. Okay, so there are times when we need to use this and when we don't need to use this. Now I can shut that off just by closing this, or I can use stop debugging. Okay, this mode actually does a lot of different things. There are several different differences to starting with debugging and without debugging. But for the time being, until we're at that point, I'm going to always choose to start without debugging. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off and you'll see all those processes shut down as well. Okay, and there was, again, no more errors and we don't have to concern ourselves with this too much. Okay, now I'll go back to the Solution Explorer because for some reason, and that's okay, it's a default setting of some kind, you're seeing that the properties dialog box or window actually opens up to talk about the form. Okay, and you can see these little bars that go all the way around our form. Okay, when I click on that form, this opens up all of the properties associated just with that particular form. Okay, we are going to be spending a lot of time inside the properties window. So what I would suggest is, if you're using this, is you can pin it so that it actually opens up. It's a tab on the bottom of your Solution Explorer, or you can open up properties. And one thing you can do is actually drag it and move it using one of these to a different location. Okay, you can move all of your windows down very similar to this. Okay, now the other thing I can do is I can close that and I can go to View and I can get different windows that I want to constantly pop up. So for example, I've got Toolbox. I can open up Toolbox. Toolbox is where we're going to spend a lot of time as well. Typically when we're in the design view, we're going to have our toolbox open so that we can go and get all these tools and drag and drop into our form. Okay, and conversely over here, I can go back to view, and right down at the bottom, I got properties window, or F4. Okay, so you can toggle between one or the other, and obviously I can minimize and maximize. I can change sizes on these windows here. Okay, and I can move them around, and I can close this window altogether if I want to, and just keep my error list open. There's also my package manager console, which we don't need right now. So I'm just going to close out everything that I don't need, and I'm just going to keep my error list open. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about three types of controls. And as you can see here, we have labels, which you can see here, it's subtotal, discount percent, discount amount, and total. Those are our labels. Then we have a text box, and this is where we get to actually type in information, or the user gets to type in information. And sometimes you also have permissions that deny somebody from typing in there, but they do still get populated based on the results of a different text box that the user can input into. And then finally, you've got another type of control called the button. Okay, really important that you understand there's three different types of controls. So in our form view, what I can do is create three different labels. Now, it's very, very important. Again, I have to emphasize this, that you understand that when you see the different tools in the toolbox that are available to us, when you see it in the toolbox view and I click on it, like I have label clicked up, what that is that's a graphical representation of the label class. Okay. It is not until I actually bring it over and I drag and I drop it that it instantiates it into an actual object. And so if you're, again, still a little bit fuzzy about the difference between a class and an object, I want you to consider, again, doing this with paper and maybe tape or glue and a pair of scissors. If you have to cut something out or get a pen and draw a label, that is a physical object in the real world. So it's important right now that you understand that these are now objects once they go to your form. When they're in this format here in the toolbar or toolbox, they're the class. Okay, and each time, and you're going to see that label 1, when I bring it back over here and I put in another one, is going to be label 2. And again, it's going to be label 3 and label 4. These are different objects. So just imagine that I'm doing this with a literally like copy and paste with paper and glue and all that kind of stuff. So I have 3 labels that I want to put on my screen. Now, the next thing that I want to put on is a button. So again, I can click on the button and then drag a button over, and I'll need a second button for this. Okay, and I'm going to drag another button. And you can see these lines that are helping to try to more accurately auto format. Okay, and now I need a text box. So if I go down to here, you can see here, I can just now drag the text box and I can line it up. You see those automatic lines that keep happening. Okay. So another really great thing about this is I can literally click on it, do Control C and Control V, but I need to move it into a better position than that. Okay, and then I can do it again and just try to visually line it up. And one last time. Okay, and I can line it up by eye the best that I can. And I can start moving other objects around on my screen now. Okay, now I have the ability just to drag and drop the size of the screen if I want to do that. But there are tools in here that allow me to do this auto formatting. And if you might have guessed where they are, you'd be correct in assuming that they're in the properties. And so when I click on just the form itself and I'm in the property tab, you can see that it brings me to all of the properties associated just with that form. Okay, and now you're seeing here where it says size, and I can open that up and I can modify the size, width, and the height of that form. And why don't we just round it off to 425 and let's go with 390. Okay, visually it seems to work. And you can see that this form, the width is 425 by a depth or a height of 390 pixels. Okay. Now what's really good is that I can highlight the entire group. I start on the top left and I drag to the bottom right and I highlight, and you can see all of these icons at the top start to light up. Just before that, they are actually grayed out. But once I highlight something in a group, you can see that they're all starting to highlight themselves. So I can say align left, and that now puts them all in a line from left to right. Now I can do the same and grab everything, and you can see that it aligns center. Okay, but that's no good for what we want to do. So I can just hit the back or undo button. And maybe we consider, do we want to do align the middles? Do we want to align the tops? See, if we align the tops, that's no good either. So there are different alignment tools that you can actually use. And so what I would say is probably best to, figure out which one you want to align the best and then go from there. So this one aligns the middles. And a popular trick to use is to actually create sort of one unit, a label plus the box itself. And then you want to start duplicating that. So if I were to go and select all this, I've got the label and the box selected. I could do a Control C and then a Control V. And you can see that it created my 5th label. And it's good to do that because it's already pre-aligned. You don't have to try to go in and individually keep each and every one of those. So I'm going to get rid of that there. I'm sure you noticed previously that what I did is I have the ability to change the size by dragging and dropping it or placing it into the dimensions I want. Or like we talked about earlier, I can go into my properties and look for its size and make the objects to the dimensions that I want. Now there is one difference though with labels. Labels, I can't really do that. There's nothing to grab. I have to manipulate that by the size unless I do one thing. With a label, if I go into this layout view, if I go into my properties and I'm in the layout section here, and you can see I can open and close all of these. Okay, you can see how that's done. And layout is here, and if I go to auto size, what happens is there's a drop down for true or false. If I change that to false, then you see that I do get the little squares that I can now, or the handlebars that I can now start manipulating that. So I can do that. I'm going to turn that off for now. I hope that you can see right now I have selected all of the labels. And you'll notice that this one here, it may be hard to see on your screen, but you'll notice that this one is white and the other 3 selections or handlebars are in black. And that is because the one that is in white is actually my primary control right now. Okay, so it's really important that you understand the difference between primary and secondary control, because when in the future we get into tabbing, because sometimes when you're not using a mouse, some people like to scroll through different buttons or functionality using the tab button. that actually determines what the order of the tabbing operations are going to be in. So right now you can see that the white one, label number 4, is our primary control. As I look at the actual form itself, and I'm not able to move it, that's okay. But when I look at the form up here in the top left corner, it says form 1. And if I select the form itself, it automatically grabs all of the properties that are associated with the form. And you can see right here, it says text. And I want to change that, instead of saying form 1 to invoice total. And this is where I can put spaces and stuff like that, because we're changing the title of the actual form. And now you can see that it's updated and it says invoice total. Now, I can do the same thing with all of my labels, but there's something that you really should pay particular attention to, and that is the naming conventions, because this is going to become vitally important just for the sake of confusion or not confusion. So here is a slide on properly naming. Okay, but at the end of the day, the most important part is this final bullet here. It says you can use a 3-letter prefix to indicate whether the name refers to a form, button, label, or a text box. And let me be absolutely clear. You should do this and you should follow these conventions. That is FRM for form, and it is BTN for button, it's LBL for label, and it's TXT for text box. If you don't properly label these, if you don't use the prefixes, I guarantee you, you are going to get confused between your objects. Okay, because it's very possible to have a label and a text box named the same thing. But you need to know which one is the label and which one is the text box. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that, because it's absolutely vital that you understand this. If you don't do this, I can't stress it enough, you are going to have a lot of confusion further down the road. Now, if we look at label 1, okay, this is the text. This is what we want the user to see. So if I change this to subtotal, and I put a semicolon in there, okay, you can see that the label text itself has changed. Okay, the text that you see on the label is just another property for that particular object. It's text. Okay, but it's not the name of the specific object itself. That is down here in design. Okay, and right here you can see it says design name. We now have to give it a name for the actual object itself. Okay, and this is going to be LBL for label, and we'll say subtotal. Okay, and so you can see when I created LBL subtotal, it didn't change the actual text of that thing. Now, what happens when I select the text box? Okay, if I were to just keep the name subtotal for my text box, if I were to change this to subtotal, okay, and then the other one was going to be called subtotal right here, how would I be able to know the difference when we start to get into the actual coding? And you might think, well, why would I really care about labels and boxes? Well, the answer is, this is an object that I can manipulate. I can change its colors. So for example, let's say that I was using this for money, subtotal, and I had a negative number. I would want to change the label of the text to be red. If it was above or a positive money, I would want it to stay black. right? So I can manipulate those properties, but in order for me to manipulate the properties, I have to give it a proper identification. It's like when you use a variable, you give a variable a name, okay? And that's how you refer to it. So this is text, and with the text, there's actually the name of the variable. So I do want you to think of this in terms of the name of the variable, okay? Same thing here. So if I were to say subtotal and leave it like that, okay, that wouldn't be proper, would it? Okay, I want it to have a better signature than that. And so I'm going to call this subtotal. I'm going to call it TXT subtotal, or not TBT, sorry, TXT subtotal. So later on, when I'm looking to manipulate what's happening inside that box, I can grab onto that variable. Okay, so that variable is now going to be called text for text box subtotal. I'm going to go ahead and change the other names of the labels and their text boxes. So now that I've done that, the next thing I want to do is go and edit my buttons. So I'm going to change the text to button 1 to say calculate. And this is going to say calculate here. And down below where it says button 1, it's going to be BTN calculate. And then the same will be for exit. So this is not going to say button 2 anymore. It's going to say exit. And this one's going to be BTN exit. Now, a note of caution, whatever you do, and there's a chance because I didn't mention it, and if you're following along, you've already done it. You may have, for some reason, tried to double click on one of these different labels or objects on your screen. I'm going to show you what happens when it does. So I'm going to click on my label subtotal. And you can see that it brings up this file called form1.cs. And it's got this form1 and it inherits from form. And it's got this form1 initialize component. And then right down below, it says label subtotal click. Okay, and I don't want you to do this yet. It is going to happen, but I don't want it to happen yet. So if you inadvertently do this, I'll show you a really quick way right now to get rid of it. So you highlight it and you delete it, and you're going to see that we'll get an error down below. And when you click on the error, it'll bring you to this page. And this whole section inside this file is called form1.designer.cs. What it's saying is that everything that we've done inside of our graphical user interface, or our form, it has all of these properties associated with it at the moment. Okay, and you can see what the different properties are that are associated with, for example, label subtotal 1. Okay, our auto size is on, our location is here. It's giving you a pixelated reference. It's got the name subtotal 1, the size, which 54 by 15, tab index position 1 because it's at the top. And that was when I was talking about the little handlebars being white or black. Okay, so because it's 0, it's in first position. And then you see this line here that says what the text is. So these are all sort of attributes of the object itself. Okay, so what we're going to, and this is why it is so important to get your labeling conventions done properly, or your naming conventions for your variables. because remember, in each one of these cases, we keep calling the variable label subtotal. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now in this particular case, I'm going to highlight that and I'm just going to delete it, and that'll make the error go away. Okay, and then I'm going to close that window and I'm going to close this one as well. And I might as well just leave it here. Okay, so remember what I said when we were talking about all of the different labels. You can see which one is in first place right now, and it is subtotal at position 0. Okay, and I want to go ahead right now and actually start without debugging. Okay, there's nothing going on. I can type stuff in here, but it's useless to me right now. But what I want to do is hit the tab button. Okay, and you're seeing the cursor is moving from position to position. And one of the reasons you're not seeing it go to the subtotal is because it's not necessarily a built-in property that is functional right now. So you can see if I were to look at this very first one here, and you would see the tab index position. Okay, and right now, believe it or not, it's actually listed as number 6. Okay, this one is listed as number 7, 8, and this is 9, this is 4, this is 5. And these previous ones here are actually in the order of precedence before that. Okay, so when you're tabbing, it's actually tabbing through these first, and then it is going through there. Okay. The last thing I'm going to change in this particular form right now is I changed the text of invoice total. You can remember that. So I'm clicking on the form and I changed the text to say invoice total, but I didn't change the name of the actual form or the variable that identifies that form. So I'm going to change this to FRM. And then let's say invoice total. And you can see that I'm using camel case for this. Okay, so I hit enter. Now I'm going to go ahead and do what I did the last time, and I'm going to double click on that. Okay, and now you can see that there's a difference. Last time this said form invoice, or it said form 1, and it was inheriting from form. But now it says form invoice total. Okay, and this is now what it is initializing as a component. And within that, it's identifying this variable label subtotal. Okay, so what we have is our form, and then it's further breaking down into a method called label subtotal click. And in the next video, we're going to come back and start talking about a lot of the properties that we have in our design view. And we're going to go into these subsections, and then we're going to talk about a bunch of different method calls that come from the library. Okay.